You know, it's kind of ironic that the name of this movie is named 9, considering the fact that this movie was not only released in 2009, but it was also released on the 9th day of the 9th month of the year. So, to match this whole thing, I decided to make this movie the 9th movie that I'd watch for Sean's yearly reviews, and maybe even the 9th episode of the series, depending on when this episode will be released. And honestly, when the fact that this movie is named 9 is the most interesting thing to say about this movie, that's an indicator about the tone for the review, and that I really didn't get into this one very much. Yeah, I made it no secret that I don't have much to say about this one. I wanted to like this movie, and honestly, I thought that I would have found this movie to be good because, being honest, I didn't get into this movie when I was little either, but that is the standard for anybody, since we're usually too young to appreciate those types of products at that age. Repeating my story from what I said in my review on Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland, when I was 7 years old, I remember when I was falling asleep while watching the movie Surf's Up. However, when I was 15 years old, I gave the movie another watch, and the movie became one of Sony's best movies in my opinion. So, I thought that the same thing would apply to 9. However, going into this movie as an adult, yeah, I didn't get into this movie. There are some things to appreciate now that I'm older, but man, this movie screams wasted potential. So, what is this movie about? Essentially, this movie is basically an adult version of Toy Story, except instead of toys basically trying to keep a secret from humans and making a child happy, this is basically a post-apocalyptic movie where all of Earth is basically destroyed and everyone is dead, and the fate of the entire world rests on these ragdolls' hands. And the ragdolls themselves are basically evolved versions of the characters from Little Big Planet. Now, what this movie does on paper sounds very interesting and could have made for a very interesting story. However, the issue that I have with this movie is that it has such little to say in such a short period of time. You know how one of the common criticisms that is often thrown at something like Hey Arnold the movie is that the film has such little to say in such a short period of time? Well, that's basically the issue with this movie. When the story was just unfolding, the film was starting to get interesting, but then when I was checking the runtime, I found that the movie was just about ready to be over. There were 28 minutes left in particular, and I was actually stunned. Like, when I found out about this, I was like, really? That's it? That's what most of this movie is like? Because usually in these types of stories, this is when the plot starts to get rolling, but apparently the movie was almost over by this point. I also don't find the characters in this movie to be very interesting, and in some cases, they're very unlikable and made me ask, why should I even root for them in the first place, particularly with 1 and 8. 8 in particular is rude and pushy towards 9. Legit, when he tries to ask questions about what's happening, 8 yells at 9 to shut up. Movie, we're supposed to like this character, right? Because this is something that a villain would do when they're holding someone captive. And when 9 is casually walking, 8 would basically push him. Way to treat someone who is basically new, dude! And 1 is basically the worst character in the entire movie. You remember in Mr. Enter's controversial Turning Red review, where he got onto the movie for not talking about 9/11, where he mentions that Ming is a helicopter parent that is super controlling and frustrating to be around? Well, I can't say anything about her yet, because I haven't watched that movie yet. The criticism that Mr. Enter gave regarding Ming from Turning Red is how I'd basically describe 1. Throughout the entirety of the movie, he's constantly super concerned about being safe and not asking questions about what's going on, that he would let the world continue to be put in danger and letting it stagnate by not doing anything at all, and he has this very passive-aggressive attitude towards what would happen to others. Given that it's revealed in one part of the movie that he purposefully sent 2 out to be killed because of the fact that he asked too many questions and was concerned about the world being saved, even though not doing anything about it is not helping anything. And when 7 and 8 get captured by this one snake creature, 1 was going to let them get killed if not for 9 suggesting to go after them. Yeah, One was going to let his so-called friend get killed by suggesting to not go after him, and by the time that they get there, A already gets killed. And as for the characters being uninteresting, it's a case of quantity over quality. While I do like the fact that this movie has a very dark tone, in fact, 9 is probably the darkest out of all the animated movies reviewed for Sean's yearly reviews so far, the movie doesn't give its audience a reason to really care about these characters at all. Comparing this movie to something like Code Lyoko real quick, what kept me invested in that show, besides the dark tone, was the characters, and the show gave us a reason to want to see those characters succeed, given that it's a life or death situation towards one of its characters, Aelita. Sure, there was only one character that I found subjectively uninteresting, that being Yumi, but that show gave us plenty of reasons to care about its other characters. Heck, even with the Brave Little Toaster, even though its characters were basic, I remember how they were like, given that most of the movie spent time with them. And do I even need to go in depth with the Toy Story movies? With 9, on the other hand, not enough time is spent with them to make their presence memorable, and 2 of those who do get enough time spent are not likable in the slightest. I'd even say that the characters in A Bug's Life are more memorable, because they went with the wise move to have all the other ants in the ant colony be relegated to background characters, and I remember how all the other characters were like. Even though I find that movie average, and I find it to be mostly forgettable, with the exception of the circus bugs, the villain, and the stuff with the bird. I'm sorry that I made this episode abnormally short. Usually I try to make these scripts around 6 pages long at most, since movies generally have less to talk about than entire shows, but there's just nothing else to comment on. If this movie was not named 9, I'm pretty sure that not a lot of people would remember this one, because of how many times that this movie's title was joked about in the marketing. And the only other reason that I've seen this movie get talked about is for one of those Gen Z childhood trauma icebergs where this movie would get talked about. Though, other than that, hardly anyone ever talks about this movie. This movie is actually in a similar boat as something like Raggedy Ann and Andy: A Musical Adventure, where for the most part, the movie has been forgotten about, but the parts that most people talk about are its weird or dark moments. In Sean's yearly reviews, I'd say that this movie is in the middle. I do think that this movie is better than Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland, because this movie doesn't have as much filler, but it is definitely one of the weaker movies that I reviewed so far for Sean's yearly reviews. I would even say that this movie is not worthy of a 9 out of 10 given the title of this movie. If any of what I said in this review sounds interesting to you, I guess you could go ahead and watch this movie. If you ever wanted to see an adult version of Toy Story that isn't that Black Friday reel, this movie may hit the spot for you guys. But for me, I find this movie average.